All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Welcome to the SCCU Daily Planet Theater, or welcome to the museum's YouTube channel, wherever you happen to be tuning in and joining us for this afternoon's program. This is the Lunchtime Discovery Series, brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education and us here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris Smith. I'm a coordinator for current science programs. I'm your host for the Lunchtime Discovery Series, and I get the pleasure and privilege of welcoming everybody into our program. Of course, all month long here for this program, we gather every Wednesday at noon here inside the Globe and on the museum's YouTube channel in order to meet interesting people who are doing interesting things out there in the worlds of science, nature, art, education, and more. And for the month of February, we have been devoting our series to Black History Month, stories of people, places, and their legacies. And so as part of this great series, we have an incredible person, I think, for today's program. Somebody who's been doing just amazing stuff. And just by looking at the stage and the setup, this is the most involved one of these lectures has gotten in recent memory. And I'm so thrilled because I barely know what's going on right now, which means that I have a lot to learn and that the opportunity for me is great. So if I've got a lot to learn, I hope that maybe everybody here and everybody tuning in online is going to take the opportunity to stick around with us and learn as well. So let me introduce today's guest speaker. That way we can get into it and figure out what is going on up here. Earl Ijames is the Curator of African American History and Agriculture at the North Carolina Museum of History, which you might know is just across the street from us, across the Bicentennial Plaza. And so I don't know how far Earl actually had to come to work today to come and join us, but we're excited to have him, excited to learn not only about longleaf pine, longleaf savannas, but its connections to people and place in North Carolina. So without further ado, we'll welcome Earl Ijames to the stage.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, and happy Wednesday. My name is Earl Ijames, seventh-generation North Carolinian, and a farmer and a historian. And to that effect, we literally, Chris, left the farm and drove through what used to be Longleaf pine country from Johnston County in the Raleigh to the museum here. So that's how we wear two hats. And so it's my pleasure to be with y'all today and share some of my research, some of my passion, and some of what we're wanting to do to help restore our ecology and remember and understand better our history. And so it's my privilege as part of Black History Month to share a very interesting story that I have been developing for about 15 years when the state and our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources asked me to be an advisor on our Civil War Sesquicentennial Committee. And so with that, we were charged with exploring all types of diverse and the myriad ways of understanding our antebellum Civil War history. And with that, I like to tell people, starting with North Carolina and our history, does someone out there know, or could someone tell us what our state's largest industry was before the Civil War?
Ooh, I might know, and I think the gentleman that brought these tools might know, but let's find out.
Yes.
Naval stores.
Naval stores, that's right. That's why we are called Tar Heels. And so I remind people that there were originally 93 million acres of longleaf pine forest, Colonel Cy Harrington, that extended literally from eastern North Carolina, Tidewater, Virginia, coastal plains of Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, westward 93 million acres, to what's called the Piney Woods of East Texas. And so with that, I'll remind people that you can't plant cotton or tobacco in pine straw. So the first industry in the South particularly is naval stores. And with that, it leads into our conversation as part of the title of this presentation, Gone with the Wind, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through the lonely pine forests from Georgia through South Carolina and into North Carolina. February 2024. An iteration of this exhibit, of this presentation, you can see on an exhibit that I had an opportunity to be an advisor and help to curate that we hosted last year at the North Carolina Botanical Garden called Saving Our Savannas, Stories of the Longleaf Pine. And you could possibly put that up in the chat, Marty, and people can learn more about that. But in short, that traveling exhibit will be here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences forthcoming, so stay tuned for that. So, if you'll look on the screen, you'll see your favorite farmer and historian hugging indeed, an ancient longleaf pine tree that I happened to witness driving down what used to be called the old Tarboro Road in southern Franklin County from Raleigh toward Tarboro. And that road basically parallels Highway 98, and in the back of the room, you can see a contemporary map of North and South Carolina and see these roads as I'm going to refer to them back and forth through this presentation. But if you're with me and we're driving along, you can best be rest assured that if I spot a lonely pine tree, we're going to pull over and we're going to have a party at the pine. We're going to hug the tree and we're going to take some pictures. All right. So on the right-hand side is a map that we're going to use for reference, and I bought an original copy here where I outline the section of General William Sherman's march through South Carolina into North Carolina, eventually ending not far from here in Durham, North Carolina, or what's now called Durham, North Carolina, that didn't exist. So after the program, you can feel free to come up and look at some of these items, as well as in the back, there are some maps. And there is also an 1835 map of the plank roads of Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And feel free to look at that, because on that map, you'll see an outline also of Sherman's march, literally from the Tennessee and Georgia line southward through Chickamauga into Atlanta. So everybody's heard about Gone with the Wind, right? Has everybody seen the movie and understand what it was? It was our country's biggest hit movie for many, many years after it was released in 1938. And it's set in Atlanta, Georgia, during the Civil War, when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's march came through that city, the capital city of Georgia, ransacked it, literally burned it to the ground. And when I go to Georgia, when I go to Atlanta these days, I was in Atlanta earlier this year, I always remark at two things: the lack of longleaf pine trees and the lack of antebellum structures. And as an archivist, I also remark there is a paucity of pre-1865 records in Georgia. So they're all Gone with the Wind. And this is part of that, but in the narrative, the Gone with the Wind focuses on the Cotton Kingdom and the demise of that, and Rhett Butler and so forth. But what I'll also add to this in tribute to Black History Month is, if you notice on the screen on the lower right-hand side, what are called freedom seekers. And these were people who were formerly enslaved, men, women, and children, who took the opportunity to take advantage of the tenets of the Emancipation Proclamation and come from behind the Confederate lines, and in this case, in many various capacities, joining the Union Army, often being literally employed as laundresses, cooks, waiters, etc. But what's happening, interestingly, in Georgia, when Sherman begins his foray from Atlanta, he realizes that he needs two things. He needs supplies and he needs road building. And so among the freedom seekers, he begins to literally select people who are identified in our historical records as pioneers. And those are people who build the roads for Sherman's army of at least 61,000 soldiers who marched from Atlanta and what they call Marching to the Sea. Now, in many people's mind, the Sherman's March ends in Savannah, and it ends with his famous 40 acres and a mule speech. But as a historian, and I had the opportunity to go to Savannah 15 years ago as the 2010 WW Law Lecturer Historian of the Year, to offer this story that Sherman's March did not end in Savannah, Georgia. It was just really getting ratcheted up in a big way. But you see in the picture your favorite farmer and historian visiting the first African church, which is part Underground Railroad history. And remember, the freedom seekers, many of them who are joining in the lines of the Army are also some joining clandestinely, still operating through the Underground Railroad. And so this church served as a hub of the Underground Railroad in Atlanta, in Savannah, Georgia, as one of the earliest African-American congregations in America, started in the 18-teens. So, as part of my inspection as a curator, I'm always interested in artifacts and things of that nature. And one of the things that some of the parishioners pointed out to me is that they actually have reversible pews in the church, so that people who are freedom seekers escaping through the Underground Railroad could actually hide away from potential slave patrollers and other people who would affect adversely their freedoms. And so this is really interesting because when you close it, the flooring is original Longleaf pine plank floors that fall perfectly in place as they are literally hammered and fashioned into the floor. And so when you look at it on first observation, you have no idea that it's a reversible pew. So the 1938 Oscar-winning film Gone with the Wind was set in Atlanta, Georgia. However, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman unleashed the full fury of his army on South Carolina, claiming that they were, quote, the home of the fire eaters and the cause of the war, end quote. And so with that, I have another item, an archival item, that I've had the opportunity also to bring that I'll share here at the podium, and it's an original centennial edition of our presentation that was published in February 1965 in Columbia, South Carolina, where the state's largest newspaper commemorated that event with all types of historical information, the routes of the march, so forth and so on. But as part of this presentation, I'm going to use the opportunity to somewhat annotate it as we go through this presentation to give a version of what many people understood from Sherman's army and what was called, then labeled, civilian warfare, all-out civilian warfare. This is the original item, and before coming over to the Museum of History in 2008, I was an archivist with my good friend Colonel Cy Harrington here, and we collect manuscripts, photographs, and other items. And this item is something of a jewel, not only because of its original 1965 primary source as a commemorative centennial edition, but within it are various images and information, some of which I'm going to share on the screen. And I'll also have this item available for anyone's inspection after the program. But among other things, we'll say that in February 16th and 17th of 1865, all hell broke loose in Columbia, South Carolina. And I tell people, quite frankly, the movie Gone with the Wind did us somewhat of an injustice because it should have been set in Columbia, South Carolina, instead of Atlanta, Georgia. So this edition somewhat goes into detail not only of the military tactics, but the human toll that it takes on that march took on everyone who was in its path. A 60 to a 100-mile wide swath that spanned, again, follow the map. There's an 1835 map on the back, from Chickamauga, Georgia, south to Atlanta, across the coastal plain of Georgia, and by November 1864, it was termed by Sherman as an election present and a Christmas present to President Abraham Lincoln. So at this point, what happens in the Longleaf pine forest is in particular, now, if we go back to that area of the coastal plain that I just mentioned in Georgia, Georgia was second to naval store production, only behind North Carolina. And in fact, doing a lot of genealogy and history, we learned that many North Carolinians actually migrate out to Georgia and out to Alabama and Mississippi to work the Longleaf pine forest before they're cleared for plantations. And so in this case, Georgia, by that time, had begun to almost creep up on outstripping North Carolina's production of naval stores. Now, let me back up a minute because I'm taking for granted that most people know what naval stores are, Colonel Si. Naval stores are the production of turpentine, tar, and pitch, primarily for the purpose of building ships. Now think about this in terms of the world economy. Before the Civil War, the majority of ships were made out of what? Wood. So the wood needed to be waterproofed. The number one waterproofing agent in the world is pitch, hence the naval stores. So pitch is derived from these longleaf pine trees. These are the original trees that I will challenge you, if you see any growing in Raleigh, come and let me know. We'll have a party at the pine. But these original trees, out of the sap is distilled, and we brought some artifacts here to kind of somewhat illustrate this. A boxing axe. A boxing axe was used to hack a wound into the interior of the tree between the bark to induce a 3 to 4 inch cavity so that the tree begins to what's called bleed. And after it begins to bleed, then you would have an item like this turpentine hack that has an anvil at the bottom that allows you to wield weight into the tree, and the tree itself begins to form a cavity that looks like a chevron. This is a really unique artifact of its kind of a hack because this is the first I've ever seen, Colonel Si, that is all boilerplate steel. And if you'll want to touch that and see the weight of it. So imagine wielding this on pine trees day after day, month after month, year after year. And what you're gonna have is a forest that's bleeding sap. And sap, ladies and gentlemen, is highly flammable. One of the jobs of formerly enslaved little boys was to go behind the turpentiners, the real tar heels, and actually collect droplets of sap and make them into camphor for lighting, which was the number one lighting source before electricity. So this is another product of naval stores. So after you have a chevron hacked into the tree, then another person will come along and scrape the sap down into a cavity so that the sap is collected into a barrel not unlike this that's fashioned on site by coopers with staves that are literally cut and hewn from the sides and the leftover laps, or what are called, of the longleaf pine tree. And so there's a process that's going along all this while, because when you're hacking a tree and scraping it and dipping it, the tree itself begins to show signs of stress, and it drops limbs and bark. Sometimes it dies. And when it does, the real Tar Heels or the turpentiners will collect that into what's called a tar kill mound. A mound that varies depending on terrain, but the objective is to distill the leftover laps of the limbs, boil down into tar. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you, if you want to see an example of tar, I brought from my collection in the back some tar that our greatest naval store show on earth, my good friend, Mr. Brian Avery, out of Harney County, North Carolina, whose collection this comes from, couldn't be here with us today, but we back in, you could bring it forward, and I would ask you if anybody wants to take a whiff of it, take a whiff at your own risk. But you probably got it all over your hands now, don't you, Chris? Yeah, it does. It's an aromatherapy. I love it. I'm a real Tar Heel. But this is actual tar that we distilled in Chatham County in October of 2024. And I was telling, actually, it's beginning to show some viscosity because the cold weather causes it to sit up and get hard. But the tar itself is a waterproofing agent that's used for various, but all these go toward actually waterproofing ships. And the movement of people during the colonial and antebellum era, people from Europe, people from Africa, people from Asia who are coming to America, they're coming over here on what? Boats. Now think about this in terms of the economy. Before the Civil War, there was some years where upwards of 90% of the naval stores supplied to the whole world came from the Tar Heel state. So it produces a level of wealth that predates the Cotton Kingdom. In fact, it goes toward financing the Cotton Kingdom as it expands westward in the Longleaf pine forest into what later becomes Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. This process is repeated back and forth so that when we come back to the war and Sherman is coming through Georgia, if you can imagine this process repeated, literally every little spark sets a flame and the fire rages. Now, two things will happen with the battles. The Confederate Army, which was led by a man named General Joseph E. Johnston, who commanded, in fact, the largest Confederate army, would use these fires to actually masquerade and help create an advantage because the Confederate Army had inferior numbers of soldiers. And so it allowed for it to be more of a guerrilla warfare, which I'll go into later. But what we also see is Sherman's army would come behind with his large guns and cannons, and it would bomb into the smoke and scorch the earth and literally set flames 30, 40 foot high as far as the eyes could see. And ladies and gentlemen, when a pine forest fire or a peat fire burns, it oftentimes takes nothing less than a tropical storm or hurricane to put it out. So what you can imagine is the fires that was depicted in Atlanta literally extended in 60-mile swaths through the coastal plain, through the lonely pine forest, through the naval stores to Savannah. And in that instance, that part of Georgia was basically left neglect of any industry. So what happens is, after Savannah, many of the Confederates and the Southerners began to barricade the advancement of Sherman's army by, if you see in the picture, cutting down in many, oftentimes, virgin, giant, lonely pine trees and use them to obstruct movement, as you can see in the picture. Now, two things: a virgin forest doesn't grow back. Secondly, when you cut a lonely pine forest, and if you cut enough of it, the forest itself doesn't return. It oftentimes turns into a hardwood ecosystem, which is a completely different ecosystem with different birds, plants, animals, etc. And of course, you can't do any naval stores and anything like that. And what often happens is, after the leaf litter of 1 or 2 years is on the ground, then any remaining lonely pine trees cannot germinate. unless there is another fire. So, according to this Confederate veteran from Cleveland County, when those cannons fired, the whole woods were on fire. So what you see depicted here is another scene from the centennial edition of the Columbia Record from February 1965, depicting a mass of humanity who are following Sherman's army. Now, if you can imagine, on one hand, the earth is burned up. On the other hand, if you can imagine tens of thousands of people following the 60,000 army, the tread upon the earth itself is going to be devastating for any crops or trees or anything to grow. So, but the mass of humanity begins to collect literally from Chickamauga and Atlanta following Sherman's army. These freedom seekers, in addition to these formerly enslaved men, women, and children, were oftentimes white sympathizers, Southerners who were following Sherman's army as well. And this image depicts some of these freedom seekers embedded within the population of indigenous people who are sometimes escaping, as well as people of European descent. So this is another map that depicts somewhat of Sherman's march into South Carolina. And again, I have this outlined on Johnson's 1865 map of North and South Carolina. And there's also, again, double outlined on the 1835 map of the Plank Roads of Georgia, North and South Carolina. But you can see the distance of those swaths vary from Savannah going north toward Charleston through the Low Country. Between Charleston and Savannah, the state of South Carolina, and before that time, the colony of South Carolina began to concentrate rice and cotton in that part of their state. So there were not that many naval stores. But once his army sacks Columbia, South Carolina in February of 1865, and again, as an archivist, it's been hard pushed to even find many records. Like our state archives is really blessed to have a lot of pre-1865 records, unlike Columbia, South Carolina. And a lot of antebellum homes that you still see in Raleigh, unlike Atlanta and Columbia, South Carolina. And so you can see from this map in Columbia, South Carolina, after leaving in February 17th, the Army heads east, northeast, to capture Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was the home of the Confederate arsenal. And the Confederate arsenal was the largest arsenal for General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army, located in Fayetteville, North Carolina, at the site of one of our sister museums today. And so I'll encourage you, if you get a chance, to visit the Museum of the Cape Fear, which is on the site of the actual former Confederate artillery fort. So what happens is, described as Sherman's army, and those pioneers in particular who are being recruited from the freedom seekers began to build road beds more specific, not only to carry the horses, the wagons, the caissons, the ambulances, the generals, all their staffs, but also the thousands of freedom seekers who are following these people are beginning to fall in line on these giant, what are called corduroy roads that are built from the forest, in addition to what's already going on in the forest of the destruction of the naval stores. But the majority of South Carolina's naval store industry is in the northeastern part of the state from Columbia. And if you know your geography, and there's a contemporary map of North and South Carolina, if you go from Columbia due east, southeast, you'll go to present-day Myrtle Beach. And from that area and back to the North Carolina line and down to Georgetown, South Carolina, where the mouth of the great PD River, which transitions into the Yadkin River in North Carolina as the largest river basin, Georgetown is somewhat the southern end of the naval stores, and it concentrates back into the coastal plain and the sand hills of North Carolina, where Sherman enters on the first week of March in present-day Richmond County. And there's a church in Laurinburg that I've noted on this map where it's called Temperance Hall, which at the time was in Richmond County, but Laurinburg out of Scotland County was formed in 1899, so at this time it was Richmond County, but that church still has the bullet holes of some of Sherman's army that came through, not only with fire, but with also ammunition, and they were also living off the land. Now, what was going on particularly is if you were a person of any means, and if you had any cows or chickens, any horses, anything edible or anything useful, it was commandeered from you, it was taken from you. If you had any valuables, they were taken. And so there are stories of people literally running out in the woods, digging holes, digging ditches, planting all their valuables. And to this day, we still get calls as curators where we found something in the ground, might be from the Civil War. Oftentimes it's not. But this was a common case. So, oops, what happens? Did I do that? See, I'm a historian and not a AV technician. All right, good. Thank you, Chris. Hey, big hand for Chris. Yes. So the Fayetteville Observer documented this, and I would, if you want to read more about it, you can go over to state archives, you can go to newspapers and read what are called 5 days of destruction in Fayetteville. Now, Fayetteville, North Carolina in particular, was one of our states and still is one of our state's preeminent cities. At the time, it was the hub of the naval stores industry located at that top of the Cape Fear River. And if you notice, there's a historic landmark there called the Market House. And from that Market House emanates plank roads that were turnpikes initiated by the state of North Carolina in the 1830s and 40s so that people could get their naval stores from the backcountry of the Piedmont as far inland as was now Old Salem and Bethabara, down the Fayetteville and Western Plank Road. If you ever driven on modern highways and seen the Highway 301s and the 401s and the 501s and the 601s, those are old plank roads that emanate from the Market House in Fayetteville that have been overlain by present DOT maps that you can see again back there. But again, all these roads were designed to get the naval stores to Fayetteville. And in 5 days, whatever naval stores were there, and in February, and March, this is really interesting because two things are going on. Last year's crude is coming to the market still. The tar is still coming in because the tar is being produced all the way up through March. So you have literally probably thousands of barrels of tar / money that's burned up in Fayetteville, and you can see it depicted there across the Cape Fear River in Fayetteville by the Fayetteville Observer. So one of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's main objectives was to capture this brand new shiny city called Goldsboro. All right, you know what Goldsboro is, don't you, Marty Wiggins? Yes. Goldsboro was actually chartered in 1847 as the midway point between the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad when it was completed. The Wilmington and Weldon Railroad was completed in 1840. It was the longest railroad on earth. And it was vitally important because it allowed for naval stores from the coastal plain of North Carolina that were not on the Cape Fear River Basin and that were not connected by these plank roads, namely in northeastern North Carolina, to get naval stores and later cotton and tobacco to the port at Wilmington. It was 140 miles long, longest railroad on earth after construction, and most sophisticated railroad on earth. So the halfway point was Goldsboro, and it was selected by the North Carolina Railroad Company as that site so that it could run an inland corridor from Goldsboro into Johnston County, North Carolina, through Smithfield and Selma, and Clayton, into Raleigh and Wake County, over to Durham Station, the town of Durham didn't exist then, into Hillsboro, Greensboro, and over through Davidson County, Cabarrus County, and ending in Charlotte. today many of us know as the present-day Interstate 85 corridor. A lot of that was literally carved by formerly enslaved men and free people of color who built the railroad between 1847 and 1855. So this railroad was a vital supply line to both Confederate armies because the northern line extended from the Virginia-North Carolina line to Petersburg, and it was supplying Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Also, it was a line blockade running from Virginia out of the port at Wilmington from Virginia. Secondly, it allowed for supplies for Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's army in the southern part in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So this was really the main objective. And many people in eastern North Carolina will say that the railroad lines was burned by Sherman's army that was so hot that they could tie the railroad ties around trees. That's hot. That's a hot fire. There's nothing really living that can withstand that. Those were called Sherman's neckties, those railroad ties that were wrapped around trees and set on fire with pitch and turpentine and tar and cotton bales and anything that was flammable, it was set on fire. And this occurred at Goldsboro right after the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, in March of 1865. Bentonville is the site of the largest Civil War battle in the state of North Carolina. You can see your favorite farmer and historian there about 15 years ago after I did a presentation somewhat similar to this, but it was based on this original London Illustrated News engraving of the Battle of Bentonville from my personal collection. And one of the first things I noticed is there are giant pine trees in that. And not to be surprised, but then doing more research, I learned that Bentonville itself, before it was a battlefield, was actually a turpentine orchard belonging to a man named John Hood, who was the largest employer in Sampson and Johnston counties at that time. Now imagine the largest employer in the largest industry probably employed a lot of people in those counties, I would say, Colonel Si. So after my presentation, being the good farmer and steward of the forest I like to think I am, I go out to the forest and I, of course, notice longleaf pine trees, but two things distinctly I noticed. I noticed that there were no babies like these grass stage and this rocket stage. There were none in 2010 that I could see on the whole state historic site. And what's even more, as a tree farmer, what alarmed me is the invasive species of hardwood that were actually killing this original witness tree that had turpentine hacks in it. And I will tell people to go to the site to this day because they are turpentine hacked longleaf pine trees from the time of the March 1865 battle at historic Bentonville that we're working to save, and hopefully they'll propagate again. But right now they're literally being invaded by a hardwood pine forest. And so we're gonna have some time to reverse that. We've only been 160 years removed, Colonel Si, so we got a little bit of time to make it up. But what you see is a cavity that is beginning to close back into the tree, and it's hard to tell from this image, but the tree, if you will look at it from the side, is actually flat this way. And what would have been placed in there would have been one of these collector buckets at the base of the tree so that the sap could be scraped into the tree, into the cooper barrel. And again, those cooper barrels are made on site by people who are fashioned as coopers. So if you're doing your genealogy, anybody out there in African American history, the coopers is an actual highly skilled trade that you'll see sometimes listed as an occupation and census records say from 1870 or so dating backwards. But this is pointing out the fact that if we don't do something to save these trees at Bentonville, those trees will be gone with the wind, just like that largest employer was at that time. So when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman gets to Goldsboro and he sees the fine job that those pioneers have been doing, he puts in a request to the United States War Department to form the last United States Colored Troop Regiment of the Civil War. And that regiment is called the 135th United States Colored Troops. And one of the people who joined that regiment is the man who's pictured on this screen. His name is Private Jack Sherrod. And he lived in a place called Nahana. Has anybody heard of that? Many of us heard of the Nahana bacon and country ham, and that's good too. But it's actually named for the swamp and the Tuscarora word of that part of Wayne County, where many turpentiners were still living after the 1840s building of the railroad. Then the turpentining in that part of the state was able to be accessed for the first time. So Private Jack Sherrod is a real Tar Heel. And he literally leaves the turpentine orchards of Nahana and Wayne County and joins Sherman's army. And on the right-hand side, you can see a copy of his 1906 United States pension application. So the 135th United States Colored Troops built the first continuous road between Goldsboro, North Carolina, and Raleigh. Not only did they build this, what was called a corduroy road, but they built it in about 2.5 weeks. Now imagine this. These are not just any trees. These are trees that need to be cut to spec. These trees need to be at least 24 feet long. As you can see, 12 inches by 12 inches wide, hewn into a square or a rectangle, 24 feet long again, and a roadbed dug and those placed cross-tied in this fashion. And then you would burn what are called the laps from the turpentiners or any other residue that could be burned on top of that to create a roadbed. And this process is going through a county. I mentioned Nahana is a swamp, or Pocosin is what we call it in our terminology. And a Pocosin, for those who don't know, is a bluff of lonely pine trees interspersed by swamp and quicksand. And when Sherman's army and some of the troopers, they account that basically most of the counties in the coastal plain and eastern part of the state were mostly swamp and quicksand. And so they had to dig this trench out of the lonely pine trees and in those Pocosins that were grown at that time. And so what was happening is when this road is completed in Raleigh in April 13th of 1865, when Sherman's army marches in, by that time, the Pioneer Battalion / 135th United States Colored Troops and those engineers had built 400 miles of these corduroy roads. Now, you have the destruction of the forest with the cannons and the fire, and then the naval stores themselves are being choked out by invasive species. The industry is on the wane, and particularly in North Carolina, and then to top it out, you're going through the areas where you're gonna dig out and cut down a large number of virgin trees, again, to make a roadbed. And again, this is the first continuous road between Goldsboro, North Carolina, and Raleigh. It hadn't been previously a continuous road. We drive this highway quite often today, United States, US 70 highway or 55 highway. And when I drive down those highways, I often remark, these should be renamed the 135th US Colored Troop Highway. At any rate, in the Raleigh, oh gosh, I did it again. Did I? There we go. I'm learning, Chris. All right, so in the Raleigh, did y'all know that Raleigh, North Carolina is the first planned state capital in America? Sure you did. 1792, it was laid out with an east, west, north, and south street, a square mile. Those areas now part of what's almost an all-encompassing downtown Raleigh. And Sherman, when he marches in to Raleigh, is the last of those 400 miles of plank road. And the road we're kind of still deciphering, but again, about 50% of Wayne County swamp, and at that time about 60% of Johnston County was swamp. And then you're coming through eastern Wake County, which is sandy loam and a lot of swamp and quicksand as well, from about Clayton, North Carolina, and coming into present-day Garner, North Carolina, and coming up literally what's called Rock Quarry Road and Fayetteville Street. Sherman's army marched into Raleigh. And people in Raleigh were on edge. The governor surrendered the city because he didn't want it to suffer the same fate as Atlanta, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina. So they surrendered the city. Governor Zeb Vance, he got out of town. He went to Statesville. And so we didn't know what was going to happen in Raleigh. Was he going to burn it? Was the same thing going to happen as Columbia? And Sherman makes a remark when he comes in, quote, "It's the prettiest place I've ever seen. The dogwoods and the azaleas were in bloom just in time during Easter week, during Holy Week." And so we think Sherman may have had a change of heart. But this is an 1872 bird's eye view of Raleigh. And I like to show this off because, Si, you and I used to be photo archivists at Archives. And when we're looking at images, we're looking at a lot of different things. One of the things we're always looking at, are trees and images. And if you look in this, a lot of Raleigh has been cleared by this time. Particularly, and I'm going to point out in this next frame, the area of northeast Raleigh of East and North Street at that time, around present-day St. Augustine's University, which was chartered in 1867, is pictured in the right-hand, upper left-hand corner, not far from that acorn. And that acorn is a good start of another segment of Sherman's army story. Is that Sherman and another general who was a Union general who commanded Fort Fisher Union troops was named Judson Kilpatrick. And he was a cavalry man from Ohio. And he had about 40,000 troops with him at Fort Fisher, which, by the way, was the largest amphibious landing in the history of the world before D-Day at Fort Fisher. The fall of Fort Fisher is what actually prompted the United States Congress to pass the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. So after the Battle of Fort Fisher, Kilpatrick's army and cavalry heads up 421 highway, a plank road that runs between Wilmington, North Carolina, and Fayetteville and Duplin County area, Sampson County area. Kilpatrick's army joins Sherman's army at a place called Mount Olive. We know it today as the pickle capital of the world. I'm sure Sherman's army took all the cucumbers that year. And once Sherman's army leaves Goldsboro, it is 100,000 soldiers strong. To give you some idea of the context, at that time in the state of North Carolina, enumerated in the 1860 census, was 993,000 people. Enslaved, free, people of color, indigenous people, white people. So you had a large number of these soldiers who are coming into Wake County, which at that time only had a population of 28,000. There are reports that there were so many Union soldiers that were camped out at Dorothea Dix Park, literally from here all the way over New Bern Avenue toward Tarboro Road, and then back over the north part of this screen toward that acorn where you see is present-day St. Augustine's University. And that site is also near Oakwood Cemetery. Has anyone ever heard of that? So Oakwood Cemetery was established as a direct result of Sherman's march. There was a Texas Ranger named Lieutenant Walsh. He was part of Confederate General Joseph Wheeler, who was a cavalry soldier, and they were flanking Sherman's army literally across the South, staying between 5, 10, 20 miles and taking pot shots at the army. But during Sherman's procession through Raleigh, they took a pot shot attempting to shoot him, But they missed him, but they shot Judson Kilpatrick through the hat, just like a cartoon. Justin Kilpatrick, again, was with the Ohio Cavalry, so their Ohio Cavalry guys immediately detected where the fire was coming from, and they chased Lieutenant Walsh from Fayetteville Street area, which is just on the other side of the state capitol from where we are, and back east of the museum here, all the way down on this map toward that acorn. And that acorn, they apprehended Lieutenant Walsh, and they hung him on the site. And at that time, there was a policy not to bury Confederate dead, so they just left him there. And so not long after this execution, Confederate sympathizers and Southerners and Raleigh citizens went over there, buried him, and established Oakwood Cemetery. But I have to say, gee, why didn't they name it Pinewood Cemetery, Cy Herwinton? Well, if you look at that closely, you can see right behind that acorn, you can't really make it out, but it's Crabtree Creek. Crabtree Creek originally is a savanna, like the exhibit Saving Our Savannas. Believe it or not, there were buffalo that used to go through there 250 years ago in a savanna that meandered up and down the Neuse River back and forth. That's why we have a present Buffalo Road in this area. And it is completely deforested. And then during the Civil War, enslaved and free people of color who labored for the Confederacy dug a complete trench around Raleigh, and Crabtree Creek was changed from a meandering estuary into Burmy cliffs to prevent any type of invasion of artillery and or infantrymen into Raleigh. So that Crabtree Creek became a barricade, and you couldn't ford it any longer. And so if you look around present-day Raleigh, Crabtree Creek is actually dredged out. That hardly any places, if you find an estuary of Crabtree Creek with a longleaf pine precocium, let me know. We'll have a party at the pine. On the lower hand of that map is another acorn. And that acorn is the site of the beginning of the Tar Heel State, the Pine State's capital, being renamed the Oak City, the City of Oaks. In 1844, Henry Clay, who was running for president from Kentucky, was on a stump tour here. And he stopped in Raleigh on Lane Street, which is on the other side of the Executive Mansion. And he planted an oak tree. And it became wildly famous. And of course, Henry Clay was one of the most famous statesmen and politicians of antebellum era. And it became another hallmark for the city of Raleigh. But not only that, the city of Raleigh was embarrassed by the fact that, and you can attest to this, if you come and touch this tar, again, anywhere near it, it will get on you for a number of days or hours, if not days. But on the carriage route coming into Raleigh, every time Henry Clay would get off, he would wipe his feet because of the tar and the sticky sap that was all over the place in North Carolina at that time. And so the delegation that was hosting him helped to pretty much forbid and outlaw turpentine distilleries within a 10-mile radius of the state capitol, in addition to renaming and rebranding the Tar Heel State, the Pine State capital of Raleigh, into the City of Oaks, which I'm sure they didn't know at that time, but it completely changed the ecosystem. Completely changed the ecosystem. Now, if you look over, there's a whole Oakwood, and if you look closely, some of the first homes in Oakwood are being built, and oaks are being shipped in from out of state to plant in the breezeways because they allow for greater air efficiency. So on the bottom left, the Henry Clay Oak, and then Oakwood Cemetery renames Raleigh at this time. So the march ends at James Bennett's house. Did y'all know that the Civil War ended in what is now Durham, North Carolina? You knew that, of course. Durham as a city didn't exist then. Durham County as a county didn't exist. It was part of Orange County. And James Bennett's house is the site of the largest surrender of Confederate troops in the history of the war, 93,000 soldiers, cavalrymen who were with Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's army. They put down their arms, surrendered, and a lot of them walked home. Today, the Bennett House, or Bennett Place, is a commemorative state historic site and is part of our North Carolina treasures. One thing I really appreciate, and I would encourage you to go to Bennett Place to see this and see iterations of this story. But one of the things I want you to appreciate when you go to Bennett Place are the pine trees. A giant pine forest in the middle of Durham. And from the observer, from my farmer observer, it's a second or third cut. And I say that because the North Carolina Railroad was built through there in 1855. And at that time, likely everything was clear cut. So what has grown back since then, with the exception of a few trees. And back in 2016, when Hurricane Matthew hit, that hurricane knocked down one of the oldest trees at Bennett Place, Colonel Si, and instead of just chunking it into the woodpile, we cut it down and made witness trees out of it. And so you still may be able to get some of those at the Bennett House. I would encourage you to visit the Bennett Place. It's one of our state's treasures. And it's also, you can educate all your friends and colleagues, I know where the Civil War ended. Now, what happens are a couple things is, those freedom seekers that we talked about, right? They literally, many of them follow and fall into Sherman's army, again, from Chickamauga, Georgia, through Atlanta to Savannah, through Orangeburg, South Carolina, through Columbia, South Carolina, across Cheraw, Lake City, South Carolina, Robinson County, North Carolina, Richmond County, North Carolina, Anson County, North Carolina, toward Fayetteville. They're people who are following as freedom seekers, and when this march ends, many of them settle over in this community. And in 1865, one of the first African-American communities after the Civil War comes up is called Hayti, H-A-Y-T-I. It predates the city of Durham, and is named for the country of Haiti in commemoration of that freedom of that country. And so, going back to the 135th United States Colored Troop Regiment, as a historian, I've been able to go back and look through that regiment. And the regiment has roughly 1,200 soldiers in it. And when you look at where they were enlisted, about 1/3 of them are in Georgia, maybe 250 of them from Georgia. About 350 of them are from South Carolina, and 250 of them are from North Carolina, like Wayne County, like Private Jack Sherrod, or some Private Tomlinson out of Robeson County, North Carolina, and these areas. These are people whose descendants, many of them still live in this area, and I would encourage them to research that genealogy. But these freedom seekers, if they didn't stay, in the case of Private Jack Sherrod, whose family still has a family reunion at the home he built after the Civil War, to this day, they still have a family reunion in northern Wayne County. But many of them, again, settle in what's now Hayti, and they comprise what later becomes a new South City called Durham. So here's an original lithograph, and it's also on exhibit in the back if you want to have a look at it. This is a copy on the screen. And so one of the things I tell people is, if you recall, Sherman's army lived off the land. If you had anything edible, he was taking it. Country ham, you're not going to get it. No Nahunta bacon here. If you had a horse, it's going to the cavalry or going to the supply lines. If you had a pig, it's going to disappear. If you had any valuables, it's going to disappear. So one of the things that the formerly enslaved people did, you know, the people who were formerly enslaved were very smart. Very smart, Colonel Si. As Sherman's army, the ones who didn't follow in and stayed where they were passing, they would take cow peas or black-eyed peas and feed them to the horses, or feed them to any kind of livestock that was remaining, so that Sherman's army thought that that was cow peas and they didn't eat it. And so, starting at that time, from the winter of 1864-65, I tell people that most Southerners, white, black, Indian, had very little to eat, but if they had anything, a lot of them had cow peas or black-eyed peas. So I say that to say is that, have you ever wondered why we Southerners eat black eyed peas on New Year's Day? It's a tradition since 1865. And come by it honestly. And another good friend of mine who actually made a song, you can look online, maybe put it in the chat, Marty, the world famous Maceo Parker from eastern North Carolina, from Lenoir County, actually recorded a song called Pass the Peas that alludes to that, to this record. So, but I tell people when Sherman's army got to Raleigh, that the only chicken left was the weather vane atop Christ Church across the street from this museum and across from the state capitol. My friends, Essequam Videri, here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun does shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong grow great. Here's the down home in the old North State. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our state motto, adopted in 1957, at a time when our interstate highways were beginning to gobble up even more of our forest land. And so I will challenge you to be like your favorite farmer and historian in the respect of when you're driving down the road or you're hiking or you're walking, look for some longleaf pine trees. Make a note of it, and my contact's information on the screen. If you email me and we can verify it's a longleaf pine, ancient wind, we'll have a party at the pine. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Earl Ijames, Curator of North Carolina Museum of History and your favorite farmer and historian. It's been my honor to be with you. Thank you.
And thank you very much. What a tale. I'm so impressed with what is it? What is it? It's the intersection of the natural landscapes, these natural ecologies, and their millennia of history in North Carolina, of longleaf pine developing in the savannas, their management over centuries by indigenous peoples, and then the way that an event like the American Civil War totally disrupts and upsets, I mean, everyone's ways of life, but also completely changes the landscapes into what we see today, now 150 odd years later.
160 years removed, you're exactly right, Chris. And one of the things, again, as a historian, if you go back to the census records, there's an agricultural schedule and an industrial schedule in it. And the industrial schedule is where the naval stores industry is measured, even though it's a commodity from the forest. After the war, Georgia supersedes North Carolina in production of naval stores because literally, you can see on this map, if you can imagine, from Anson County, North Carolina, present-day Union County, North Carolina, westward to Robeson County, Columbus County area, in this swath toward Fayetteville and Goldsboro, and then from Goldsboro and the swath back through Harney County, where Averysboro was the Turpentine Orchard as a battle site, as well as coming through Johnston County, which Johnston County had mostly virgin timber because most of it was not accessed until the North Carolina Railroad was built and completed after 1855. So at this time, you had a lot of activity that was literally vanquished in an instant of Sherman's march as it comes from Johnston County in the eastern way through into Raleigh, and our state's largest industry is gone with the wind in a nutshell.
It's a wild story. So I'm going to look around real quick. We've just got a minute or two remaining. If there's anyone here in the room, you've got a question, something you want to know a little bit more about, wave at me. I'll hand you a microphone real fast. Otherwise, we'll express our appreciations one more time for Mr. Earl. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And have a look at some of the maps and look at the trees and the artifacts. They'll be up here for a few minutes. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
I was about to say, we're not actually done yet. If you're here in the room, come and check out the artifacts, the trees, and the specimens that we've brought. Maybe a good chance to have more conversation too.
Yes.
But thanks for coming out today, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to today's program. We hope we'll see you again next week, Wednesday at noon. Of course, for the month of March, we'll be getting started with our Women's History Month series. Information about that is at eenorthcarolina.org, the Office of Environmental Education's website. Go check it out, and it'll be on the museum's website as well very soon, as soon as I get to it. Thanks, everybody, for coming out today. We'll see you again soon.